What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. I'm Scott here with Michael and Drew, as always. And today on the Elder Scrolls podcast, we are talking about the furry friends, the Khajiit. Which one of you guys would like to start us off?
Well, Khajiit are obviously cat people. They're obviously bipedal, so they walk on 2 feet. Although there are lots of different breeds, or there's this other word, fur stocks of Khajiit. So there's all different kinds. Some walk around on 4 legs, like a saber cat. They're quite nimble and agile, and they have somewhat of a bad reputation, I would say, across the other provinces of Tamriel for being thieves and sneaky people who, you shouldn't trust. So within their own province, obviously those stereotypes aren't a problem. Outside of that, they do tend to be. But those fears do come from somewhere, which is their innate natural talent for those things, their muffled footsteps. And they're, they are great.
To be fair too, it's like they also have they have a thief god as well, a god of thieves, and there's a few.
So in addition, they have thief gods and a bandit god and things of this nature. They also worship the Daedra. Which they all see Aedra and Daedra as spirits, but they do worship the Daedra. So they're one of those cultures like the Dunmer who follow Daedra, which can also be considered weird to many other cultures. If you go to Cyrodiil and you say, hey, I worship Azura, well, that's more of a tame Daedra. It's still weird to most people. Your common folk in the Imperial City would be like, ooh, cultist, watch out. So you're a cultist to them, look like a cat, and have a reputation for being a thief and a bandit. So you're not off to a good start.
We should also establish that a lot of the coolest lore and a lot of the religion stuff is sort of treated as it is a more past thing. It's probably still exists in plenty of spaces, but there's this whole Riddlethar epiphany and that whole thing that came about. So it's kind of it just came along and sort of more or less deleted the old lore because the older lore about their religion came in with
there was a lot of contradictions with the old lore as well, which we'll get into if we talk about the Riddlethar.
So I guess I should say as well, it does depend on what time period you're looking at when you look at the perception of Khajiit, but I wouldn't say it's that much better by the time of Skyrim.
One thing I want to say just about the Khajiit and sort of elsewhere in general, and it's one of I think the best examples of ESO's lore that they've added, but they have made the Khajiit are to me the most interesting in terms of cohesive theme, just basically with the moons and everything in there, and it's sort of affecting everything from their sort of biology to their religion to their culture. It just even the moon sugar that they ingest, it's just all neatly intertwined, and it's a really nice example of it. It doesn't feel very segmented and spread over. It's every piece gets pulled. It is
well built, and there is another example of why they don't have the best reputation, which is Skooma. So moon sugar is a huge part of their culture, and they can tolerate it a lot better than the other races. When moon sugar gets refined into skooma, and then basically what happens is it gets transported to other provinces as a kind of black market good, and that leads a lot of people to ruin, or as they say, to stray from the path, which is a big part of their culture, And there's that, like the Dunmer, funnily enough, they have these kind of testing gods and spirits who try and drag them off that path.
Yeah, there's interesting
overlap.
There's some interesting similarities and overlap there, with their religion, especially of the Good Daedra, because as you know, the Good Daedra, Azura, Mephala, and Boethia, but Azura is the centerpiece of early Khajiit religion, and really is important. And also Mephala and Boethia are decently important there too, and they are also seen as allies of Azura in there. So you've got the Good Daedra neatly packed as a little group, but
it's kind of an important thing to establish is that when it comes to their origins, which will lead into their religion, it's not quite as straightforward as just being a beast race, and this is one of those things where ESO did have the ability to, their lore existed for the Khajiit, but there wasn't tons of it, and it was quite easy to start from a blank slate. So, one example is from Father of the Niben. You've got Topal the pilot, who's when the Aldmer are looking for Old Meris, they set sail in several directions looking for their homeland. And Topal the pilot finds Tamriel. And as they're travelling up the Niben River, there's this quote, "The cat demons of 4 legs and 2 ran the river's length." So the idea is that the Khajiit were seen on the shores before the Aldmer knew they existed. So the idea is that they're a they're one of the races that existed on Greater Tamriel essentially before anyone else, and they're one of the beast races. But then when you look into the creation myth, which doesn't necessarily it's not mutually exclusive from this, but the idea is that Azura chose them from the Elnafey, from Nirni's original children, picked a group of them and changed them to be, the fastest, the cleverest, the best climbers, etc., which ties them back to the elves.
Yeah, so because that was the idea because in their mythology, there's lots of mentions of their neighbors, the elves, like the wood elves and stuff, and their god Ifri, which is Ifa, is it in also? Yeah. So that's I think overall, there's a lot of lore that's been added in ESO since that kind of disrupts the sort of typical Aldmeris migration theory quite a bit. Like the idea now, there's a relatively convincing idea that the ooze and the wood elves that came from it, and then the elven stock that was changed by Azura into the Khajiit was there since before the high elves show up at Somerset the Somerset Isles and so on. So it's kind of, which also implies kind of if Khajiit came from elves, then the wood elves would have had to be there before Topol and stuff.
Well, that's what's interesting when you consider kind of like really old, almost Dawn Era type stuff. But when you hear of wood elves constantly shifting form, like their wild hunt power, like they can't really control it. They're just changing back and forth from elves to different animals and stuff. And then at some point, Ifri taught them how to retain their wood elf form and keep it. And they had to kind of promise to never, change their form again unless they have a grand emergency that calls for it. But then obviously, some of them were plucked and turned into Khajiit, which is almost like an elf half shifted into an animal or a beast. You can almost imagine them. I know they're kind of changed, but in my head, I can imagine a kind of like as they're shifting around, it's kind of like.
Well, this might just be a fun thing for people to headcanon.
Yeah, it's a little theory.
When Azura first changed the people, it's like the Ohms, the fur stock that is most close to the elves, and then as the moon cycles went on that whole year after Azura first changed them, they went more and more bestial, and then it sort of creates like a lunar cycle like that.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. It's a really good way to kind of canonize, it was always canon, but to kind of justify a really weird part of the lore. Like when you see the original sprites of the Ohms and the Ohms Rat, it seems really strange that you've got these man-faced cats.
It's kind of funny because that's what originally it was, and it's kind of the same with the Argonians to a degree, but it's just sort of post-lore copes to explain why Khajiit looked like the way they did beforehand. So then they explain it in the retrospect.
They're kind of
and
good
it
copes,
turns out to be really cool.
They're quality copes. They're not bad ones. Because, they do the same thing with Morrowind, right? Like, they have the Khajiit there with the beast feet who couldn't wear, armored boots. Instead, they just become a different breed of Khajiit. And it makes sense.
Yeah. But that's the thing. When you go back far enough, things become much more open to interpretation. Like, say you're looking at the annotated annuad for the origin stories of the races. You've got the Elnafey landing on Nirn, however literal that may be. And it's really clearly divided in two sections: the wandering Elnafey, who are the ancestors to men, and the old Elnafey, who landed on Tamriel, and they are the ancestors to elves. But it's like you've got these scattered groups landing in different places, and they kind of manifest and evolve differently, to the point where like the races of men, if you look at the Sayesi, the Red Guards, and the Nords, there's not a whole lot making them familiar with each other. And the same can be said of the elves. They probably didn't all land in their homeland perfectly the same. So the idea that a god could get involved, like Azura or like Ifre, and transform these old Elnafey into a different variation, just like the humans were different variations, makes sense. So you can understand the origin story. This is
it's related, but I just thought of it's interesting Azura's involvement, because going off the sort of wandering Elnafay versus old Elnafay, she has had a vested interest in the old Elnafay, aka Els, and their descendants and so on, in turning them away from that sort of path. In a way, like obviously with the Velothi and going off with Boethia as the good Daedra in Resdane, and they become the Dunmer, the Daedric worshipping Dunmer, but then also changing the Khajiit and giving them their culture, and she became the centerpiece of their culture. It's kind of interesting. I just wonder if we could look into that more and her role in
it's coming up
them.
in a video I'm working on, but we did mention it in the Dunmer podcast. Is that the Kaima were kind of led, you could argue, to protect Lorkhan's creation. As you're getting at, they differ from the Anuic teachings and embrace the Padamaic. And then when you look at the Khajiit, they're designed to be the best climbers so that they can climb the lunar lattice, set the moons back in their path, and keep things intact and stop Daedra from destroying the world or whatever else from destroying this creation. So Azura, for both the Dunmer and for the Khajiit, is kind of protecting Lorkhan's creation.
I mean, I guess you could probably firmly put the Khajiit then in, I guess, Padamaic, really.
I'd say so.
I think so. Even if
they're fairly passive, they're kind of, their mythology and their ancient role is Padamaic in nature.
Yeah.
I mean, cats are pretty chaotic, right?
That's one thing that I don't know. I hope I haven't said this on the podcast before, but it's like so much about the Khajiit made sense to me once I got myself a cat, because I've got like a fly screen in the other room, and she always climbs up it. I'm like, well, okay, I can see where they got the inspiration for this lunar lattice lore, because cats are always climbing up anything they can get their claws into.
She's out there smoking a pipe, just stealing all your shit.
Yeah, terrible.
But yeah, so there's a lot to talk about with the Khajiit.
Oh,
so I guess
I'd say they have some of the most lore out of all of the races next to Dunmer. Because of Elder Scrolls Online, they have so much lore. So we'll never be able to cover all of it in one podcast without that podcast being 3 hours long.
Yeah, there's the biology. I guess we could sort of talk about the biology and the variety of which. So you can get from sort of the Alfique, which are the tiny house cat kind of creatures, all the way up to these like smaller Khajiit humanoids with digigrade legs, to larger ones, and to like the ones that you see with more human-like legs, down all the way to the Sench and Senchrat and so on, and they're sort of, more like a tiger, like a real tiger or something, or a lion. But then you also even have like the which one? The big tall jaguar ones, the Pama Rat. Or tiger, sorry, tiger.
I feel like being an Alfique is like one of the most emasculating positions to be in. Like seriously, because there's this one quote about the Alfique, which obviously, because they just look like a house cat, is it says they can't put their own clothes on. So sometimes, but they still wear outfits. So it's like, they'll have someone else help them and put their outfit on. Like they just feel so like imagine
considered one of the most intelligent, right?
Well, I mean, does it?
So I guess it's kind of like their role is almost like
I know they're magically
leader.
gifted. They're magically gifted.
Right. I always associate the Alfique with being kind of like oftentimes in the role of the spiritual leader.
They I guess they can be, but I mean there are other Khajiit, obviously like the clan mothers and like anyone else related to religion, who would also have, if not more reverence and obviously more reverence and respect and talk about teachings and things.
And this is what's kind of whack, and it's not really discussed for reasons you can imagine, but like, you can have an Alfique theoretically give birth to like a Sentra.
So I think now's a good time to say that while we're talking about first stocks, there's a kind of joke we love to make on this podcast, and we're not going to make a single one in this one. We're not going to make any joke of this variety. You have all three of our words on that. But yeah, no, it is strange how it all works.
There's some logistic problems there.
Well, and that's
but I'm sure it adjusts.
Yeah, because like you'd think that, say, two Alfique mate and have a litter. What if they're born under the phase of the moon that means they're Sench? Yeah, and then I feel like I've always had a headcanon to rationalize it that they all sort of come out a little bit more amorphous, general cat-like, and then kind of grow into something. I don't know.
Yeah, I believe you boys need to know
that is mentioned, isn't it?
After birth, it is said that they are smaller than the newborns of men and Mer. So they do come out as like a very and apparently they look similar to
But
human
I guess it
newborns,
does
but
make
they're much
sense.
smaller.
You know how
After
like
weeks
kittens,
after their individual morphology becomes clear.
yeah.
So they have rationalized it in there by saying like they all kind of come out as this generic small, kitten, and then after a few weeks you can tell, oh, this is going to be a Sench Rat. Wow, I can't believe you pushed that out. But
Well, it's interesting, as you kind of touched on anyway, in that like such a diverse biology could lead to a sort of sense of specialization. Perhaps it could be
Absolutely.
spiritual leaders or
Alfique are used to
what
spy
is-
and infiltrate in other provinces because they look like a cat, and a lot of the lore that you talk about in the Elder Scrolls, you take it for granted, but it's not known in other provinces. It's not known by commoners. So they
Yeah.
can go to other provinces. I mean, to be fair as well, you can't distinguish them really from a normal cat, particularly, obviously, if they're not wearing clothes. If they come over and they're wearing some golden hat, then sure. But if they're just sneaking around nobility, they'd be extremely good spies. Another reason why you can see that people don't trust them. And they don't even talk in the presence of outsiders because they just don't want to deal with the hassle and kind of, have all that annoyance. So when there's outsiders around, they're said to be quiet. They'll speak in the presence of other Khajiit. They can speak to outsiders, obviously, but it's kind of like a common thing that they're quiet.
Well, that's what's interesting with all of their different specializations. Like they've got the little light ones jumping around the trees, casting magic, and they've got their big warrior ones and stuff like that. They have also got the main, which is like the spiritual leader that comes around and it's born under the dark moon, where you have the moons align and you get the birth of a main. Which there's some cool like. What's kind of ridiculous, crazy old interpretations of the lore when like everyone would like cut off their own hair and manes and sort of attach it to this one giant's mane.
Have you
like
seen the
one
concept
main
art for
character.
that?
Yeah.
The concept art of the mane is really, really cool. They used to carry the mane
Yeah.
around on one of those, it has a fancy name, but one of those podiums where everyone carries kind of like a corner that they used to put like, kings
So-
and stuff on. But now they don't do that.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a spiritual leader of the main is a spiritual leader of all of them, and kind of a political leader too. But I think it sort of arises out of Khajiit started off with the 16 tribes that became 16 little kingdoms and so on that and the way at least I envision it is how you sort of have like in times of history that there might be kings that can exercise degrees of power over others, but it's not as straight up and down as like the modern sort of nation state kind of hierarchy. You know what I mean?
It's different.
like, yeah.
Well, as you were getting at with kind of like how the moons allow their culture to be very kind of uniform and applies to every aspect of their lives, it does affect their politics, because there was the idea that these 16 kingdoms, they lived together relatively harmoniously, and they would kind of alternate in how much power they had depending on the phase of the moons. Say both moons are full, then Senchal is the kind of the foremost voice in elsewhere at this moment in time. And there's one slightly awkward thing about that, which I think this is one of the initial contradictions in the Khajiit lore, is that there's the idea that this has been around since the early First Era, but then so the pocket guide in the 3rd edition says since the beginning of the First Era, the Khajiit have always had this system where the 16 kingdoms alternate rule based on the moons. Whereas in the 1st edition, it says that Ridfar Ridata came along, he had his epiphany, and there's a good line to kind of sum it up. But he says, he bestowed to the classes equality under the bilunar shadow, dividing their power in accordance with 2 moon starts of the Jacquenet. What this established in a more understandable sense was a rotational power base in which both sides of Khajiit society, the city dwellers under the nobility and the nomadic tribes of the desert chieftains, shared alternate control of the region based on the phases of Massa and Secunda. So it seemed like maybe he revived something that had died long ago, or the idea is that he came up with it. But
yeah,
I was under the impression he was that was talking about the 2 different sides of elsewhere, like Palatine and as they pronounce it in Elder Scrolls Online, which I don't particularly like, but it is what it is. Anequina, instead of Anaquina, which I was always saying beforehand, or Anakina, it's Anequina. For most of the NPCs, don't get me wrong, there are some NPCs who say kind of like Anequina, but
it's
others
the same
go
with
Anequina.
Palatine. Some say
Palatine.
Palatine, some say Palatine.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, either way, yeah. So I think the idea is that he instilled this political system when there were two kingdoms, but it also existed back when there were 16. But the arrival of the Thracian plague in First Era, either 2200 or 2260, wiped out so much of the population that they couldn't realistically maintain 16 kingdoms anymore.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes
so
sense.
it gets a little confusing because it seemed like an epiphany, but it was actually what they historically did for 2,000 years plus. You know,
Well,
so
a rediscovery.
I always saw this Ridthar Radada kind of guy as, in a way, similar to Alicia, in some ways, kind of like with this leading to like Riddlethar and the whole new pantheon of gods. Just in the sense that like it was kind of like doing away with the old, and then you bring in the new, and there's Alkosh and like all your other ones gain more importance. And
yeah, it's kind of almost so like in a way you could look at it as like both in terms of like the spiritual simplification and centralization instead of lots of different tribes or practicing all of these different spirits.
That's what I kind of mean, like with the
also
nods and the like just
reintroducing like Anaquina and Palatine too, or Anequina, whatever, is that is also like a sort of political centralization more so. Instead of like 16 kingdoms spread all over, it's just kind of going big geographical regions and grouping things. So it's a big kind of movement towards centralization of state and religion as well.
Yeah, with him as the dictator of the whole thing. Because that was the one line I left out. It says at the bottom, the terms of this measure, the Riddlethar, were overseen by the thinly veiled dictatorship of the Main himself, which is extremely convenient for his epiphany. But there you go. That's the way it works.
Yeah. Well, they did go into the confederacies when they were all, one. And then that gets broken up again when the Thalmor kind of come in and bring back the two moons, which disappear later in the Fourth Era. Take credit for it.
Because now they're client states.
So it's back to Anequina and Palatine, but each of these two big kingdoms, so you've got North and South, are a client state of the Thalmor. Which, probably works to help them, keep it a bit more fragmented and like easier to control, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think it's also, you can have that, just even the cultural differences between the jungle-dwelling Khajiit and the desert-dwelling Khajiit, and there's historical animosity between them at different times. So,
Yeah, because there's the idea that rather than having the diverse systems of 16 different kingdoms, Palatine and Anaquina just essentially became polar opposites of one another, where you had this kind of like disciplined warrior culture, and then kind of a well-focused plantation, moon sugar, higher mercenaries kind of culture, where everyone's a little bit more laid back and lives a pretty luxurious life.
And think they're far more noble as well. It's a much snobbier area to the south, where it's kind of like, the rich nobility, and that warrior culture to the north, they're barbaric, they're barbarians. Whereas you'd almost look at the warrior culture, could look at them and see them as a bit more degenerate, and despite them thinking they're more noble.
It's interesting, and I wonder how much Riddlethar had an impact on modern elsewhere. And I kind of hope that in ways that older religions did survive in ways, because you have the clan mothers that have a reasonable amount of autonomy separate from the main as a spiritual leader and so on, and they're responsible for telling all of the cultural myths to their children and so on. So you can also get and expect, as with any sort of oral tradition, you'll expect regional variance and regional importance on certain gods and so on. So I kind of like to believe that a lot of the gods, the divisions of wandering spirits, sky spirits, etc., and so on, and like Kanathi and so on, all are still important to a lot of the tribes and stuff in their local areas, and that it's not just like, despite the existence of, you know,
they also added in moon singers, which is kind of like what the Bosma have with spinners, and they're meant to be greatly respected, and they tell ancient tales and stuff, which, to be honest, I feel like this maybe should have fallen under the domain of the clan mothers more. But, I mean, regardless, there are these moon singers, and they know all these ancient tales, some of which are secret. And there's even some really ancient tales that are split across several moon singers in order to like, maintain its secret. So no one knows, like, the whole tale. Which I find a bit weird because, you know, what happens when you bring it all together at one point? Can't someone with a good memory remember it? I don't know.
One thing I find that's rather unique about Khajiit religion is that, as much as we were kind of like having a jab at it before, that they have a bandit god and a thief god and so on, I think they have a good amount of honesty about the reality of everything and of life and so on, and all of the different positions that people might find themselves in, compared to a lot of other religions. So, for example, if you look at the imperial cult, all of the gods and the gods that they worship or respect embody a sort of virtue or something that is necessarily, like, I guess, good or whatnot. Whereas you'll even have, like, you know, Boethra is a patron of warriors, but also of exiles. And you have Bandar, the bandit god, or you have Rajin, the thief god. And you sort of have all of these gods that embody a diverse amount of roles, but sometimes, you know, an exile isn't necessarily a good thing, or a bandit or a thief, or so on.
It's interesting that they do have this kind of holistic pantheon when you look at their gods, because there's Aedra who are virtuous, just like, you know, they are in other cultures. They have some of this, like, similar ones like Mara and Stendar, which have their own names, and they also have the Daedra, like, you know, Dunmer have Daedra to worship, who as well as testing gods and things like that. And then they have side deities, and they seem to have, it's not like every Khajiit would worship or venerate every deity or anything, like any society, but they do seem to fill out all of the blanks in a cohesive way.
Yeah. Well, the way they do this is they don't have this sort of like binary between Daedra bad, Aedra good.
They're spirits.
They just group spirits by sort of their locality. Like,
and they all have their utility. You know, because, if you're looking at the Imperials, if they're staunchly pro-Aedra, who all have their virtue, and very specifically a virtue, it can't be anything negative, and then you just completely demonize the Daedra, which for the most part is understandable, but then you have such a kind of like afraid conservative society that can't really come to grips with any of the challenges of life. I think
it's also too, like, and you get it with a lot of like earlier cultures of our real history and so on, that gods and spirits and so on are sometimes meant to be, you know, placated or revered and respected, but not necessarily like thrown at your feet worship kind of thing. And that they all play a role in the myth. They're almost like characters in their myths. And you learn in the same way that we learn from, you know, stories about people and characters doing different things. They're all fictitious, but I mean, obviously in the Elder Scrolls it's not, but they learn from each character's got something to learn from it and so on. So, you know, even in Boethra, it's like, you know, there's very good virtues there and her being a warrior and so on, but then there is that, like, you know, wandering your own path, exile kind of thing that's just a little bit
I mean, with Boethra specifically, you actually see that they don't. It actually specifically states for her that they don't worship her traditionally, and that they honor her by walking her kind of path, or, like, you know, walk the walk, not just talk the talk. It's like worship by doing.
And you can imagine, like, even in the Mephala, they say, like, which is interesting for her too, is the lust for truth. For those who search after, like, Mephala, and you can imagine that, you know, it'd be a little bit more like bit of investigation or like scholarly pursuits are sort of venerating her more. So I feel like the reverence of any particular god in the Khajiit pantheons has more to do with your actual lifestyle rather than religion being kind of separate from your lifestyle more so. I know they do still have, like, you know, Zenithar of commerce and whatnot, or toil, I forgot whatever one it was. It's commerce, isn't it? Zenithar, commerce and toil. And,
yeah. No, it is. Because, it's easy to mix up him and Julianos, but Julianos is more magic and learning.
But yeah, I guess we could go over some of the gods, because I know, Drew, you love the Khajiit story. You want us to start us off with the basics and roll us in?
Okay.
Because
Well, wait. So
It's big.
okay, how do I
It's
do
big.
this in not 15 minutes? I mean, okay. So essentially, you have. I may slip between the Khajiit pronunciations of the gods and the more common ones, but essentially you've got Anur and Fadamai. They're cat gods, they're designed in the image of to make it more relatable to the Khajiit, so they have litters of children. And the idea is, that Clan Mother Anisi's story tells very specifically of which spirits were born, but almost all of them would have been born of their relationship. And they have 2 litters of kittens, and then Fadamai wants to have a third, but Anur doesn't. So she tricks him and does it in secret, and then he finds out at the end and essentially banishes her to the Great Darkness, or she flees to the Great Darkness, which is where Lorkhand or Lorkhaj is born, and the ramifications of that is that his heart is corrupted, and Namira comes into being as a result, and several other Daedra are involved there in how they come into being. So then they have this society that comes along because Azura, one of the favorites of Fadamai, and Nurni, they're both sisters, and Nurni is given the ability to give birth to all the children, and Azura is given the ability to pick some of them and make them the best, which is.
Oh, and quick interjection there too is just even the idea that Nurni or the Earth is actually personified in Khajiit religion. You don't really get that in any other, I don't think. Maybe
Yeah,
in some
not
Bolsonaro
beyond
stuff.
simply kind of referring to Nern as female. That's pretty much all you get from the other cultures. But yeah, so essentially Azura did this, created her chosen people, and kept it a secret from Nurni because Nurni was extremely protective of her children, and taught them how to kind of maintain, as we spoke about earlier, maintain the mortal realm to ensure that it's never destroyed by any meddling spirits. Except for Ifa, who is terrible at keeping secrets and was the lover of Nurni, found out what Azura had done, told Nurni, and that caused some problems, and they were cursed to live in a place of deserts and harsh rainforests where... so that all happened, and then
That's
where
a
do we
pretty
go
good.
from
That's a
there?
pretty good
Yeah.
summary. I must say, because generally it takes a long time to go through all that, but that gets the gist across pretty well. There are many spirits that come from it, and I like the whole litters thing. Interestingly, there's a spirit that we don't really know anything about, and the name's not even known, I think, except by Azura, Boethia, and Mephala. And this spirit is hinted at or thought by theologians to be Ebenarm. But basically it's this dark spirit, and
It appears in songs as a black panther or
yeah.
a warrior in ebony armor.
so it
or
sounds
as a
like
hidden
your
sword.
ebony warrior, Ebenarm kind of vibe character, but it's all very secret. I do like some of the old texts that kind of categorize the spirits as well. So you have like the sky spirits, Azura, Jojon, Kanathi, Magris, the worldly spirits, and there's some Daedra we haven't mentioned, but like Homora, Hircine. And it's funny because there's actually interaction between Azura and Homora, which would be looked at by like the modern Khajiit as kind of like blasphemous and like weird, because it's a prior to the whole Riddlethar thing. But that's all quite cool. Nurni is in the worldly spirits list, as is Sangan, a god of death and secret murder, who isn't seen as like bad as he is in other cultures, but is just seen as like a cat that will pull you off the path with temptations. And I find that interesting too. This is like a little thing. And Drew, you have a kitten or a cat, but they do gross things, right? Like, they'll kill if you let them out. I mean, or in the wild, they could kill a bird or a rat and bring it to your front door.
It's a gift.
It's a gift. But I almost like how, in my head at least, that could be kind of personified into their idea of Sangan, that these lustful things which other cultures would be like, oh, that's some really like gross hedonistic blood ritual thing. The Khajiit are more like, oh yeah, it's distracting. do you know what I mean? Like, be careful. It'll pull you off the path.
Yeah, like the predatory instinct
is not
distraction.
It's not demonized because it's natural to them to have some kind of like more animalistic side. At least that's how I interpret it.
It can absolutely change on a whim as well. 1 second they're being really cuddly, and then a bird flies by and they're like they go insane. They go insane at the snap of a finger. So it makes sense culturally for them.
They also have, as we said, Ifa as a worldly spirit.
And isn't it Hircine's skullhead is?
So the idea is that Hircine was in love with Nirni, but Nirni shunned him and chose Ifa. So Hircine killed I can't remember exactly his name, the great stag of Ifa, and chopped off its head and made a mask of it. So that's kind of their dynamic, which is cool.
Yeah, and they have Ifa as well, as I was saying, in the worldly spirits list, and then they have the wandering spirits, where things get a little more confusing a bit. So there's Aka, which is like one of the eldest children of Anur and Faramai. So they've got Aka, but then they've got like Alkan and they've got Alkosh. So it's kind of like...
This does get confusing.
I just wonder if that was more or less... I know, because I know or if they've just added another one in, but either Aka or Alkar being the sort of Anoyel kind of equivalent. And then you've got Alkosh being the Oriel.
It does make sense, because like Anisi only mentions Alkosh. So it almost seems like there could be a bit of confusion or misinterpretation of the roles based on the fact that we know there's kind of the Aka over Soul and there's so many different splinterings.
Well, the Aka is known as the Pathfinder and the first cat. Interestingly, his father's advice was to find love. He mated with the winged serpent of the east. So, you could think Akavir. The June Queen of the west, so Yakuta. And the mother mammoth, which sounds very like, Atmoran/Nordic of the north. He is said to have disappeared when he traveled south. In his place, Alkosh emerged to warn the others of the things Aka had created while traveling the many paths.
So perhaps the
interpretation
they have a
pretty
there
complete, like...
That's the explanation for the other races, essentially, is kind of Aka's doing. I mean, as I mentioned before, with kind of some of the spirits, the offspring of Anur and Faramai, weren't actually born from the litters and the mating. That's kind of summed up in the dark spirits, because Lorkaj is the main dark spirit, and we've mentioned that. Namiro is the darkness in his heart. Noctra was born from the black blood that fell from the heart. And then Varmina was the fear of Faramai losing her children, so kind of manifested into a spirit. And then obviously we have that unknown spirit of vengeance. So the dark spirits are very much the kind of not physically born ones.
That's actually interesting because, and I'll pull that into my Vaymina video that I'm currently making. But in the Vaymina podcast, we were talking about how her realm kind of seems like everyone says her sphere is dreams and nightmares, but really they just seem like a tool for her true sphere of influence, which seems to be fear/terror, and I suppose illusion and manipulation type stuff as well. But in the Khajiit pantheon, it specifically says, she's born from Faramai's fear of losing her children. So you have like a very direct link to this concept of fear with Varmina.
You can even say she literally is a manifestation of fear in that scenario. So it's
it's quite interesting, but you don't hear that talked about as much with other cultures and how they talk about Vaymina, at least the cultists particularly. But yeah, so those are the dark spirits: Namira, Noctra, Vaymina, and that weird Ebenarm type spirit of vengeance who doesn't have a known name to history at least.
But it's only known by Azura, Boethra, and Mephala, which is interesting.
And speaking of which, if we go back from the dark spirits, Boethra and Mephala are considered wandering spirits, which...
Yeah. And what I saw, the other part too, with Boethra there, rebellious exiles as well. Just the rebellious word too. It's like, it's like a patron of rebels almost. It's like and
there's that strong connection there with Lorkaj, with Azura, Boethra, Lorkaj, and Mephala kind of being allies, which is, I don't know, nice and fits into Drew's theory in his video that he's working on.
I love the Mephala part, the known to be the recorder of hidden guilt and eternal shame, and then it's just interesting, like the little secret.
It's like that unknown spirit of vengeance is almost like the Dunmer idea that the good Daedra bestowed upon them, the triangle truth, the Sijic endeavor. It's their kind of secret to give to their flock. And since they're the only ones who know about this secret spirit of vengeance, vengeance being associated very much with the idea of Lorcan, and the same with Ebony as well. Ebony is, the idea is it's his blood flowing through Nern. So, it's almost like, that's one potential thing. If it's not Ebenam, it's their secret.
Even the hidden sword, I'm sure you go through the 36 lessons of Vivek and finds the connection between, because obviously there's lots of poetic symbology in the 36 lessons, and a sword, I can't remember exactly, but it could be used to personify the sort of endeavor of Kim or ascendancy. I'll have to look at it, because in a way, reach heaven by violence is sort of what Kim is said to be, in short, or what Vivek says about it. So as to reach heaven by violence, but by the sword, but this path, this triangle truth, can only be summoned or manifested by Azura, Boethra, and Mephala, which are the three good Daedra, which instruct the Dharma.
Interesting.
A spirit of vengeance too, with no will of its own, which implies more so that it is somewhat, I don't know,
kind of like an idea rather than a spirit.
Yeah.
Because I feel like Ebenam would have a will of his own.
And actually trying to find, when you actually look into who Ebenam is as a deity, finding how he fits into the Khajiit spirituality is kind of strange. Mm-hmm. It's hard to find many solid links there.
And then you have the adversarial spirits. So these are kind of like your Dunmer, the equivalent of the Dunmer's House of Troubles.
It's House of Troubles +1, really.
So you have Merid Nunda as the +1, which is Meridia. She is the daughter of Magrus, who loved only himself and his own creations. There's something about her which is quite interesting. I like this idea. She is intellect without wisdom, knowledge without purpose. She's a cold spirit born of light without love. So I know we basically called her a bitch in other podcasts before, but you can really vibe it there, light without love, basically wants her dad's affection, essentially.
It's interesting there that she's that they blame her. So she's the consort of demons, and some songs blame her for the orchestrating the death of mighty Lorcaj. Whereas in other things, haven't we sort of hypothesized that maybe she had a favorable view of Lorcan, and that was the sort of consorting?
That definitely. But that's a kind of awkward thing about Meridia is I don't mean to diminish what she does and what she's achieved, but she's very much kind of associated with reflections, and she's kind of a reflection of Magrus or Magnus as one of the Star Orphans, but then she defects pretty quickly to consorting with illicit spectra, or whatever the exact term is. And then in the Khajiit pantheon, the idea is that she worked alongside Molag Bal to manipulate Mehrunes Dagon into attacking the lunar lattice. So it's really hard to know where her loyalties lie. So she is very adversarial in that sense.
And then in Elder Scrolls Online, she comes and kind of is helping you with Molag Bal. Yeah.
Things change over thousands of years.
That's true. That is true. And we have Mehrunes, who is Mehrunes Dagon.
Eternally young.
Yes, and a god of cat-like form, thus as a kitten. For what is more destructive than a kitten, right?
I even also like just the eternally young part, but if you think of it as revolution is always inherently young. It's some sort of upstart thing that comes out to tear down the old, and it's the new.
Even look at just our own history, all rebellion and kind of counterculture type stuff and revolutions. It's always the younger crowd rebelling against the status quo. So that's interesting. And Mehrunes actually had a very popular follower known as Darlok Bray, who was a Khajiit warlord who cared about the traditional Khajiit culture, but also worshipped Mehrunes. And rule under him was said to be very brutal. Some describe his reign as glorious, but it was said to be also by other accounts very brutal. And he basically tore across the top part of Elsewhere, and basically
he's the because he's at he's in Rizlav the Righteous. He's at the coronation of Emperor Gorius.
This is first era stuff, there. 5th century first era. By the way.
The golden beast of Anaquina or Anaquina.
Just go with whatever you say
Anaquina
first.
is what they say.
Don't cave in.
Don't cave into the law.
But ESO,
Peer
as
pressure.
we said, every different character says every different word differently, and we say it how we want to say
I
it.
sat through a lot of Let's Plays last night, listening, and pretty much
I tell you what,
90% of them say Anaquina, some of them say Anaquina.
I tell you what, in a way, it's realism, because if you go around to the English-speaking countries of the world, there's very different pronunciations of different
Have you heard
words.
anyone outside of England try to pronounce any town or city in England?
Yeah.
Tottenham.
Or like albino versus albino.
Oh, we used to cop a lot for that.
Bournemouth.
Yeah.
Look, we could go on forever.
It
adds character to the
Drew,
world. So
to Drew, it's tomato, but it's really just Anaquina. As much as I don't want to accept it.
If you get it wrong, it adds flavour to the universe. So if we ever get it wrong, we're doing it to make it interesting. So never ever tell us.
Adding a little bit of spice.
Yeah. But no, this warlord was very powerful, as well as kind of like setting up that whole warrior culture and all the martial tradition and martial arts stuff which came from it. Which, as we know in Elsewhere, there are all kinds of different martial arts and styles, because they have claws as their weapons, which sets them apart from pretty much all other races, because they can often use that instead of a sword or a dagger or something. They can just slash at you with razor sharp claws.
And that's also noticed their claw dances is like also a form of like meditation or like spirituality for them that's moving, unlike the others that sit in silence.
It seems like claw dances are kind of like what has been come to know, like collectively call all the martial arts.
Yeah, all the gout fang and the whispering. Is whispering fang another one of them?
Let me see. You've got. I think they added one more. You've got gout fang, Rawlith Kaj, and whispering claw.
Whispering claw.
But it's I think you combined it with like wet fang, like that.
Karate?
Oh, there is whispering fang as well.
What? Where is it?
Oh wait, no, but okay. Never mind. It said Whispering Fang, but then I clicked on it and it took me to Whispering Claw.
Right. Anyway,
for some reason in my head, when I recall the Dark Brotherhood scene when you first walk in and there's all the members and he's like, he wasn't just a Khajiit, it was they were making fun of him for killing a Khajiit, and then he's like, he was a master of the whispering thing.
Hold on.
It says also
known as. Okay, I stand corrected. But yeah, so apparently there's Whispering Claw as well. But then there's this other one which there's actually a card in Legends called Desert Wind Champion, but there is a claw dance or martial arts fighting style known as just Desert Wind, practiced by the Order of Monks at the Desert Wind Adeptorium.
Don't want to see Desert Storm.
On the outskirts of Orcrest. So they have their ancient techniques that they preserve with scrolls kept by the Grand Adept. They use a lot of dual sword techniques with balanced blades as well. So anyway, so they have all their martial arts, which is quite cool. Goes along with everything quite well. Going back to spirits, after Merunes we have Molag, which is basically just Molag Bau, who will test the Khajiit. And
one of the 12 demon kings.
It says, you will overcome him with the might of Boethra, the will against rule. And there's also Orca, who is, like Orc is Malakath, or a demon very similar to Malakath, who followed Boethra back through the many paths. It spoke in curses of affliction and knew no other words, and was battled with ancient songs by Lorkhaj, Kanathi, and Boethra, and could only be banished and could not truly die.
See, that's interesting too, because putting him, if that's seems to be taking Malakath as very literally as Trinimac, as the Daedric form of Trinimac, because there you've got Lorkhan as in like Shore, and also Kanathi as in Kine, like two really important figures of Nordic pantheons, and then obviously Boethra being Boethia, the one who stabbed him and betrayed him and so on. But that's kind of very...
And it's convenient that in a pantheon that's headed by the good Daedra, they've kind of removed the more positive aspects. So say they've taken the vengeance from Orca or Malakath and left him just with the spite. So he's almost more of a pathetic kind of spirit to them than he would be in any other culture that acknowledges Malakath.
And finally, Shegarath, the Skooma cat. So their god of madness is a cat with a nice little Shegarath outfit, which I suppose, even though he looks like an Alfique, because he's a Daedric prince, he probably could put it on himself. I don't think he had to ask for one of the other spirits to help him put that on.
I've had a video idea for a while, and but I've still got to think about it more and get it to work. Because I like to make there any sort of like, I guess, good insight. But it is kind of interesting that, you know, Azura being the head, they have the good Daedra, and they also have, like, you know, not word for word, but pretty similar adversarial spirits or the House of Troubles. It's basically the exact same for almost the exact same reasons, but they also add in Meridia or so on. But I just wonder what potentially, if there was any like chimera influence in early days as they moved along, because obviously, you know, like religion or any form of belief is somewhat fluid. Like, it has adaptations. Like, even the most, you know, straight to the word have their own divisions and so on. So you can imagine potentially if there was any
it's almost like missionaries traveling to foreign lands. Like, when the Velothi are crossing, it makes sense that they would cross through elsewhere, and as they're doing that, they'd be pretty adamant about preaching their word to any sentient creatures they came along in the process, you know.
Or maybe Elder Scrolls Online lore was getting a little bit dry. And so the writers were given the advice, look to what people love about the Elder Scrolls. And so they looked to the Dharma and said, let's make the Khajiit more like this. Who knows? Yeah. Who knows? The other cool thing about the Khajiit religion is obviously all these other gods we mentioned earlier, such as Bandar, who is basically like a personification of their cleverness and wit. You have an animal god called Ius or Ius. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that.
Ius.
What did I say? Just whatever you said first, go with it, Chief.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
This is a very obscure god. This one. It's like a rod carrying misshapen humanoid.
See, it's the same thing that you can look at with all.
It's in Daggerfall. It's like
I've mentioned before that there's it's from ESO, but it's about Nedic worship, and there's associations that I tried to make with Mara, but like some sort of like fat mother sort of bee god, and then I think that's also like a nod to the like that statue, the ancient prehistoric statue of the fat woman in the Willendorf woman or something like that. I forgot, whatever. Anyway, it's a real world artifact of like ancient worship. It's like a fat god. That's why it's Fat Mother. But anyway, an obscure god, but also I was trying to connect to like this Aelid insect god, and that there are potentially many other gods or spirits that just aren't known by mortals or aren't worshipped well. Like, you know what I mean? It's not necessarily that there's just the finite amount.
The more you read about the animal god Eos, the more you think this will be one of those gods left to history and never talked about again. Like a real Daggerfall thing. Like
it's the same as Ebenarm and
let's get real Australian for a second. But
Sigh.
the source on Eos comes from a book in Daggerfall, and the story involves a wombat. So that's very Aussie. Yeah, there's a full. I mean, here's a Lady Grillina saw her father despairing the loss the town was suffering, so she brought her wombat in and told him, "Father, my wombat can save us all, for it is sacred to the god Eos, god of animals. The reason I didn't tell you earlier is because I am an early adolescent going through that period when I don't like to communicate." Gosh, that's terrible writing. Just can I say, that's crap.
That's what all teenagers say.
That's crap. But please ask a wish of my wombat and Eos will fulfill it, for my wombat loves me. The king thought this was fairly flaky, but he had nothing to lose, so he uttered a modest wish to the wombat. "All I want is for one business to come to Rock Creek that will never leave, no matter the calamity." I probably should have mentioned before that the king had always been cruel to the wombat. He used to lick it and try to make it stick to walls. So the wombat had Eos create an equipment store in front of the palace gate that would never go away. The royal family ended up going mad and eating one another, and ironically the wombat was one of the first to go. But that is why there is to this day an equipment store blocking the palace gate in Rock Creek. If you don't believe me, go there and see.
Dude, this sounds like a story that like belongs in
A
like
kindergarten
the Adventures of the Magic Pudding. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
you remember
erasing
that?
this
Do you know
from
that
my
movie?
knowledge.
I am
Drew,
What have we discovered? What have we
Hold on,
discovered?
wait, Drew. Do you know the Magic Pudding movie?
No.
No a clue. No a clue. Seriously, do you, Michael?
Yeah.
Like that Australian?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it an
It's like this
Australian
really.
thing?
I'll like put something up. I'll try and find it. It's this really obscure old like sort of Australian animated kind of thing. I think it was like out in the 90s or early 2000s or something.
There's going to be like
But,
two people watching or listening.
Yeah,
Oh,
the Magic
yes.
Pudding.
Yeah. But how like usually I would say that I'm pretty like generous about not like outright calling writing crap. But come on.
No, Daggerfall's the best, bro.
No, come on.
That's
The reason I didn't tell you this is a girl talking to her father.
Yeah.
The reason I didn't tell you earlier is because I am an early adolescent going through that period when I don't like to communicate.
Yeah.
She
Bruh.
communicated that really well, though. You know, she didn't just.
Oh, anyway, moving on to other gods. There is Srendar, which is Stendar, which in Khajiit traditions, or some of them at least, he's made out to be more like a runt and was birthed last in the first litter of Faramai and Anu. There's also Mara, the mother cat. They have Rajin, who is quite an interesting god. The trickster god, or footpat, cat who walks. This is their basically king of thieves, thief god. And he's got some cool stories.
Yeah, the stealing the tattoo from the Empress of Kintyre as she slept is like the coolest thing, I think. It's just sort of like a mythical theft.
And then,
It's
like,
cool.
you know, drinking contest with Sangin. So I feel like he's got a pretty good life. It'd be
And
actually
he
pretty
stole
good to
the
write stories
ring.
about that.
He's just Khajiit Jack Sparrow.
He saw
We have heard
the
of
ring
him.
of Khajiit on Mafala's 8th arm.
I got that one.
Yeah.
He seduced Mafala by appealing to her vanity and stole the ring off her arm while they made love. Like, that's some pretty like dashing rogue kind of
Yeah, sounds
move to make.
pretty cool.
Dun,
Of course, we
dun,
talked about there's
dun,
Riddle
dun, dun,
Thar,
dun.
who is kind of contested in his like godly status. Like, is he a god, or is he just like a more like a saint almost?
Yeah, he's
It's
kind of
not
just
really-
a main who had a realization while meditating, isn't he?
And
So it's,
yeah, but he kind of like ascended to
Mm.
godhood, or at least if you venerate.
or
There's a
considered a
few-
cultural
Like, you
hero,
know how, like,
kind of like a
Riemann-
Riemann.
Yeah, like but
There's a few examples, like, well, because Rajin's technically like that as
Mhm.
well, in terms of he's a sort of was once mortal.
so what was it? A mortal who seduced a Daedric prince? That's pretty.
yeah,
before
because he
ascending.
grew up in Senchal as well.
Oh yeah, in Black Kyrgo, that like
Yeah,
slum
and then-
district. So he grew up quite poor.
yeah.
Which actually, mentioning Kiergo, weirdly enough, it's spelt slightly different, but I think that area is named after the king who married. I need to find their exact names, but the kind of the monarchs of Palatine and Anakinna married to form the Elsewhere Confederacy, and I really hate this aspect of the law, but like it's kind of always been a bit tongue-in-cheek that it's called Elsewhere, but it's actually explicitly said that the reason they decided on Elsewhere is because of an old Khajiiti proverb, a perfect society is always found elsewhere. And I kind of hate that ever got acknowledged, and I'd rather it was never acknowledged.
Yeah.
But there you go.
I don't mind it.
We also have, if I should just talk on, I should just talk on Bandar a bit more, the bandit god. Because Bandar is interestingly, like we talk about the similarities between the Khajiit and the Wood Elves, Bandar is also found in the, religion of the Bosmer of Valemwood. Although there he's he's more like a god of archery and a patron of thieves and beggars. Whereas to the Khajiit, Bandar is like a way of life, like rising to the challenge, defeating your opponents, and there's more bandit elements involved, which is interesting because it just makes me feel much better about the highwaymen. You play Oblivion and that there's like often Khajiit highwaymen that try and rob you. It's kind of cool to think that they might be kind of a follower of Bandar, or like worshipping and not just someone out to get your coin.
Well, also when you consider proximity, like all those ones through like the sort of Skingrad to Anvil and all that, they border Valenwood and Khajiit and elsewhere and so on. Like, in ways, many of these places in the south of Cyrodiil are closer to Valenwood and elsewhere than they are to like Bruma, for example.
But that could also
Like,
just be proximity of the race in general, like that the highwaymen down there would be, what races.
But also the interesting there too is like regarded more as a manifestation than a formal god. And there seems to be a bit of that. Like, I mean,
like same as this other god, Kunzari, who is kind of like a mythical Khajiit hero known as the Laughing Lion and the Imprisoner of Dragons. And his spirit features in the Elder Scrolls Online, like an ethereal version of him. So, he's there as well as someone who doesn't seem to be like a god.
Yeah, like that demigod-y sort of vibe.
Someone who ascended by doing epic things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've kind of covered all of the gods
I just
by
wanted
name,
I just
but
wanted
there's
some clarity there for him before I said it. Yeah, he lured the the dragons into the halls of Colossus and sealed them away, where they would become kind of demons in legends and stuff until, obviously, in the Elder Scrolls Online, things get a bit chaotic and the dragons come out to play.
Well, I guess one thing that's probably important now that we've kind of talked a bunch about the Khajiit characters and stuff like that, but we should probably move on to, I guess, even their afterlife or just sort of their core spiritual kind of practices, and we could bring up the Dramathra. But as Drew mentioned earlier, that Namira is sort of like this darkness from the beginning that basically tries to sway the Khajiit from the path and turn them into bent cats or Dramathra. And this whole sort of path to, and I guess the path is really talking about the path to the sands behind the stars, like in the afterlife. Your whole life is a journey to path, but to do it properly, you want to go to the good place, not the bad place. But the bent cats are the ones that are turned from the path. But it's just interesting that they do have this sort of, and I'm sure it's a vague kind of path. I think it just means it as in like life. I don't know. What do you guys think about it? Like, it's not like there's some really like dogmatic idea about what is and is not.
Just be a good Khajiit and don't fall prey to any of the testing gods and have them consume you, and I think you'll be all right.
Yeah, it's kind of just not disrupting the way of things, the lunar lattice and the cycle of the moons, and living a good life. And it's kind of, the Dramathra are the physical manifestations of that dynamic between Lorcage and the rest of the cats. Because he was born in the darkness, there is an inherent darkness to him that kind of physically manifests in his heart, and so Namira's role is to kind of corrupt cats the same way that the darkness corrupted Lorcage when he was born.
Yeah. Sand Behind the Stars sounds like a pretty chill place as well.
Because the alternative is the Dark Behind the World, or I think is what they call it.
Yeah, but imagine like dunes formed by sugar. And
always
like warm
without
end, like it's this real like moon sugar.
I hope it's not too warm. Imagine it goes all like syrupy, like that sugar like melts and like gets all just going through dunes of like grainy syrup.
That's mad. You're making me hungry.
But you'll drown though.
Yeah.
What if you
I'll be the
drowning?
kid in Charlie in the Chocolate Factory who's like, yeah, let's
as your
go,
lungs just
jump into
slowly
it.
fill with syrup, and
Okay.
it's just like
But they'd be getting high in the process, wouldn't they?
Yeah, maybe it would feel good. Might not be the worst way to go in some other realm, just being filled with syrup. Anyway, I suppose what we could actually do, because this is the Khajiit podcast, and we haven't talked enough about all the different types of fur stocks or breeds. What we'll do is we'll leave the kind of history of Elsewhere more to a Elsewhere specifically titled podcast, I think, where we talk about the province more as a whole. But let's talk about some of the breeds. So we talked about the Alfique. There's the Alfique Rat. They tend to add Rat when there's just a bigger version. So it's just a bigger house cat. Like, we don't really know too much.
Yeah, so you can essentially half it and talk about the Rat and the normal in one.
Together,
in one bit.
There's the Cathay, which is kind of like a more... like, you see them in Elder Scrolls Online. They look kind of like a humanoid cat. It gets confusing because there's a few humanoid cats, so it gets confusing. No, they're said to be slightly larger and stronger than the Suthai. Sorry, the Suthay.
Is Cathay not the like kind of like the Skyrim default?
It
one?
looks it.
Or is that the
Yeah.
Cafe Rat? Yeah, it might be the
Or
Cafe
the Cathay
Rat.
Rat.
Yeah.
Cathay Rat were nicknamed Jaguar Men by the society.
Yeah. And they're said to be more agile than a werewolf and possess phallic barbs. Had to get that in the podcast.
But the Cathay have the human feet. I think.
Yeah, they
generally
do.
like
They look
Cathay
very
Rat.
normal, I guess, is the normal. They look just what you're used to seeing when you think of Khajiit.
So
Yeah.
sapient.
They look like a
normative, cool.
human in a fursuit, essentially.
Yeah, now there's the Dagi, who are kind of like smaller. They look more like lynxes in the face, but they're like very small and nimble. And these are the ones that are said to be able to kind of dwell up in the treetops of Valenwood, even like where wood elves can't climb. So you can imagine the advantage they would have in wars and things like that.
There's a good
if you've ever seen
passage-
monkeys climb on the, in the canopy of tree branches, you can't climb there yourself or you'd snap it. But there are some Khajiit who can, yet they're not like Alfique small. They are humanoid, just small and wispy and whatnot. And there's the
Yeah.
Dagi Rat, which is just like a bigger version of that, who can still supposedly, go up in those branches and not break them.
If you want a really good like little story about it, it's in I forgot what do they call the period of time just before when Jagarthan's got everything under control in the third era. I forgot the name. Simulacrum, that's it. In that, there's a bunch of different wars, like the Arnesian War and so on. But there was obviously there was a Khajiit Valenwood border war, and there's a book about that. It just describes it really cool because that's all the Dagi. Right.
Those Dagi and Dagi Rat are also said to be really good with magic. So you could almost imagine in a war if they were up in the branches using like illusion spells would be cool to like control things like frenzy units of wood elves they're fighting or like mess with them and stuff. But you're unable to climb up and kind of stop them. It would be cool. Then there's the what?
I was just gonna say, it's mixed unit tactics and about during the 5
book.
Years' War.
Yeah.
That's the book that if you want to look into it.
So there's the Ohms or Omes. How do you think that's pronounced?
I've always said ohms, but
Yeah.
Ohms Rat. These are the ones from, or Ohms at least, are from like your Daggerfall, extremely man/elf in appearance.
weirdly, ESO, with the exception of some statues, decided to leave them out. I guess they didn't really want to have to tackle what it would be to design a human.
The statue also has a tail.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Which I think kind of makes more sense.
Yeah.
I kind of like it that all of the Khajiit at least have
just
tails.
should have
rather than it's
tail and
just
cat
one.
ears or something.
Yeah. But yes, though they're actually said to even go to the effort of tattooing or painting their faces to resemble a cat more. Because, and you can imagine these are the kind of ones that Pellinor may have slaughtered when he came to, on his rampage and mistook Khajiit for elves.
Yeah.
Who knows? Omes Rat, again, just like a bigger version. They do have like a light fur coating over their body, and obviously they have a tail, which,
Hazel, those like Guinness World Records of like the hair, they have like a genetic defect of like the hair grows all over them. That's kind of all I'm imagining. It's like,
but it
plus a
doesn't
tail.
it doesn't appear that the Ohms or Omes have a tail. When you look at the picture,
Maybe it's detachable.
it
I just
don't
it
think
seems
me
like
how
the
they
Omes
attach
Rat
it.
are said to have a tail, but like you haven't really.
but it's on the statue.
Yeah, but you haven't really seen them like.
It's just wrapped around its leg on the statue.
But
But
that looks really weird. Looks like it's coming out of a different spot.
I would assume I'd assume it's a tail. That the other was, at least in my head, I would go that the Ohms have a tail too. The Ohms, that old Daggerfall.
This is
thing
your
is
head
just,
canon.
It's just so old.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm sure that look, if there's an ESO if there's a Elder Scrolls game and there ever is an Ohms, I guarantee they'll probably have a tail
I
because
think so, too.
humans with a tiny bit of fur or is boring or like just feline eyes, like it's not enough.
Anyway, it doesn't do it for you.
It's not enough to justify an extra like.
It doesn't.
race.
It
Like, I don't
doesn't
think
excite you.
Well, people wouldn't get people wouldn't get excited by just like, oh great, I can play a Khajiit, but remove basically all of everything that makes it a Khajiit. It's just a human with feline eyes.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds boring.
But I
as
mean,
hell.
it could be cool interspersed among the whole society because it just adds more variety.
Yeah, no. So I'm not arguing eradicating them. I'm arguing just making them just a little bit more Khajiit.
Yeah.
Like, with the tail and
I mean,
and
to
the
be
fur
honest,
and-
one critique you could have is that a lot of the Rat versions don't really need to be there. A lot of them are kind of just like, oh, same thing, but a little bit bigger. Same thing, a
Yeah.
little bit bigger. But, anyway, moving on. The Parma, the giant
Chicken Parma,
That's
mate.
exactly what that's why I paused.
I was thinking that, but I was like, yeah,
that's
that's
what I
another
thought.
reference that only a fraction of people would understand.
Australian reference. And then the Parma Rat. But these are like big Khajiit. Like these are like very, like one of them is known as Barzahar the Bull. But they're like very tiger looking and just big dudes.
Yeah.
You don't want to mess with them. And the Parma Rat obviously are even bigger. They often get, hired as bodyguards and they would make fantastic soldiers and they're extremely tall. That's kind of like
cheese
your-
and tomato sauce.
yeah, alpha male Khajiit. That's like the opposite of an Alfique. You don't want to be born as an Alfique. Well, I mean, they get made fun of and they don't like that because they get patronized.
They're Sigmas, bro. They go their own way.
It's a little bit awkward because, like, you can understand why ESO had to kind of divvy out their resources properly, but you can look at the cafe rat, the dagi rat, all of these, and they're all very hard to distinguish. They're all practically the same size, and variations on their fur make it very difficult to know what breed they are, but their initial descriptions are much more diverse, I think.
I mean, yeah, the Parma specifically are definitely like big, but yeah.
But they look bigger than the Parma Rats, for example. If you just go off the couple of examples, a couple of examples I've seen in game, they're fairly
some of them do.
indistinguishable.
Yeah.
I tell you what, they...
Oh,
Sorry. Well, the Sench.
Yeah.
You're about to go on the Sench. Yeah, I tell you what, they did gimp the Sench Rat in
100%, yeah.
because they were supposed to be these like mammoth-sized cats, like ridiculously huge.
I mean,
but
here's
they're-
the description. They're meant to stand as tall as 2 Altmar and can weigh as much or more than 50. But then it gets this new kind of like annotation from the source Moon Bishop Hunal Answers Your Questions, which is an Elder Scrolls Online Lore Masters archive. And it says, some say these claims may be exaggerated. And it's like, we didn't want to put big mammoth cats in our game.
Yeah.
That would be, doors would be a problem. Architecture
Yeah.
would
But you
change.
don't play as them, you could just keep them outside and be like, they often travel with a smaller companion who is said to go in if they need
To be honest,
things
as if they
inside.
couldn't have done it in Central, because it's
could
not like they
have.
have to be inside. They could be like, they're so big.
They're
they
more
have
like
to be
campfire
outside.
type, except they have
Yeah.
campfires and they're more outdoorsy.
And like I said, you can just have some cool lore about them that's like, they often travel with companion or they're eager to make friends because these friends can basically give them all the utility of what they could find inside with favors and things like that. And in return, you can ride on them. You know what I mean? Like a kind of like a win-win relationship. And then obviously, so the Sench Rat, if you look at it in the Elder Scrolls Online, they just beef up its shoulders and chests and head, but the back end of it, like its legs are quite low to the ground, like nothing like as tall as 2 Altmar, even on the front from the look of it. The concept art from Legends is pretty sick though. That's looks like a much bigger, scarier cat. Yeah, but they're also really intelligent. So despite being massive and obviously really good at tearing things to shreds and being, these beasts of war, they're actually smart. They speak. They have fantastic memory. They hate having the stereotype of being a beast of burden or having an owner. You know what I mean? Like they want the idea of it to be like teamwork, not you own me and I take you around wherever you want. And they can even cast spells, so that's cool. The Suthe are kind of just like what you see in... Well, they say the Suthe Rat are what you see in Morrowind. The Khajiit with beast feet.
Because and they specifically have the the legs with the digitigrade
Yeah,
legs.
Well, it's beast feet, right? With the
Where it's kind of like the extra knees as well.
Yeah,
like the
yeah,
way
like-
their legs work.
yeah. Like they look more springy, like they could run.
Well, it's
faster
not an.
and
It's
jump
actually.
higher.
I saw this thing explaining it. It's not actually an extra knee.
Yeah,
It's
it's at
kind
the
of
ankle,
screwed.
right?
But like that's their. This is like that is their whole
Yeah.
foot. The extra because they have a knee up here and then it goes down, and this is actually their ankle.
Yeah. Like a kangaroo kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to come off as like ho ho ho, but couldn't you tell?
Uh-huh.
I don't know. It looks to me like exactly like not an extra.
No, I
knee.
know. But
Yeah, the extra
because
knee
it's
was a
backward-
passing comment. It definitely
Yeah.
wasn't like, oh, that's scientifically what it is. But yeah, essentially their legs look different.
Yeah, like a kangaroo, like a springy, bouncy type
Yeah.
thing, or like some raptor like being. Yeah, no, that's really cool. But anyway, it is said that the Toejay Rat, so the slightly bigger ones, are what you find in Morrowind. Then the Toejay are just like a smaller one that you don't have as many interactions with. Another mysterious one is the Toejay.
It's kind of not much said about
Not
them really
much
outside
said.
of living in the marshes.
They don't
you
look-
kind of imagine.
They don't look particularly unique. Like they just look like, again, like at least based on the statue, like what you would picture as a filler normal kind of Khajiit in your head. Same as the Toejay Rat. Although the Toejay Rat do have the digitigrade legs. So that is something special about them. Obviously, we already talked about the main, so we don't have to go through that. I do like that whole idea. We were talking about the cool concept art and the hair, but as a tradition, they still do honor the main, like a lot of Khajiits, by removing their own mane, and the main still wears a headdress, but it only has the hair of the main's tribe specifically and his like warrior guard. So it's like still several hundred members, but it's not the entire population anymore because it's grown so much, and it would be very impractical.
Just to go back to the beast feet, the legs. Also, that was what I heard recently. Just to make it, just having it phrased this way is just more interesting. But they're constantly walking on their toes, like they walk on their digits, like they're on their toes. So their heel is off the ground all the time. So it's
They're
just
kind of on the ball of their foot, right? Like with the toes touching the ground.
yeah, it's like that front part, but it's like you don't walk with the whole of the foot, like
Yeah.
because like technically it's all foot all the way back up,
Yeah.
like to the ankle point. But yeah, anyway.
Interesting.
Pretty cool.
Well, that runs us out of fur stocks.
There's, I mean, like, look, as much as there's kind of things like, oh, you can talk about their architecture. It's like, oh, you can look at it. It's like very like Southeast
Well, like
Asian.
I
There's
said,
other-
we can talk about that in an elsewhere podcast that probably would cover the landscape and the province a bit more than the actual Khajiit themselves specifically. Like the FudgeMuppet podcast will be around for a while, so you can expect different discussions and coming back to, like we said with the Dunmer, we'll come back to Dunmer. We're not done talking about Dark Elves forever. And the same would go for the Khajiit and their province of elsewhere.
I guess one last little thing, if you wanted to tack on to the end of Khajiit and so on, what do we reckon about any potential relation with the Kapotan and of Akavir, the tiger people of Akavir, and also interestingly that it's interesting that where was it with Akka talking about how he went around to all of the different lands and had children. It could be, and I mean, look, that kind of means
Whatever it means.
Red Guards, and that means Red Guards and Nords and everything. But I wonder if there's any sort of connection. There might not be at all. It might just be like, I've honestly always kind of vibed that it's a little bit of laziness on the part of Akavir's design. That's just like, oh, there's tiger people here.
That's
too,
that's what
because-
I thought. And I think
like-
when you think about people's idea of Khajiit in their head, I feel like it would Elder Scrolls Online really gave the opportunity to show these different fur stocks, and so you see Khajiit that really just look like a tiger straight out of a documentary in the face, right? Whereas before people saw them, they have tiger features, but more like a big cat or a lynx or something like that. And so you could easily see if you were designing races, like you've got this cat race, and then, these ones in Akavir, they're like proper tiger race. But then now the tiger part of Khajiit has become more emphasized through different breeds. At least that's just me having a stab at how the creative process could have gone down, which diminishes the uniqueness of the Kapotan a bit.
Yeah, like the reality is when Akavir was theorized, the races that they placed there were all very typical when you think of the East,
Yeah.
these
Oriental.
are the creatures you think of.
Yeah, that's what I think.
But yeah, it's hard to say. I guess we probably won't learn more about them, and there are interesting things about the Capotan. But
one thing I will say before we wrap up, to throw shade on our thoughts, is they do have a similar like language, or at least like how they spell things, like with like lots of apostrophe, like Capotan with apostrophes and things like that.
Would you say that's similar to?
Well, Khajiit have all the, you know, I
yeah,
don't know, like they have.
I guess the kind of like the very
common.
like individual
other,
syllables.
They have apostrophes.
No, but what
dude,
other?
I mean,
Name
we
what
have
other race-
apostrophes.
What other race has that? Like so, like prominently, I guess.
I guess yeah. No,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
But I mean, a lot of world building stuff does that, because it's like, oh, this is the exotic race. Here,
And,
throwing apostrophes. So
yeah, but it's
like,
just an interesting coincidence that both kind of feline races have it.
It's
Yeah,
kind of
true.
it's very like monosyllabic kind of words, like Capotan. It does, even though the
Yeah,
apostrophe's
that's
in there,
true.
it doesn't sound like you don't see many Khajiit words like that.
The only other thing is obvious is the whole dragon cat. Like, if you go Dragon King of Cats, you've kind of quite literally got a Dragon King of Cats in
Like with
Akavir.
Toshraka and stuff.
Yeah, and if there's any potential sort of thing there, but
Oh, I'm not trying to say that it's like a perfect. I'm just like
There
food
very
for-
well
food
could
for
be.
thought.
We just don't know enough. Is unfortunately the reality when it comes to Akavir.
Yeah. But I suppose that brings us to the end of the Elder Scrolls podcast today. This has been the Khajiit podcast. Thank you very much for watching. Social media links are in the description below. If you want to help support the channel, you can follow us on Patreon or buy some awesome FudgeMuppet merch like I've got on here. And we look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.